Do I look orange? Am I a little bit orange? I don't know, it's hard to say. Step away from the camera. Step away. So here's Robert with Reading Through History, and we're here for another section of EOI Review, Everything You Need to Know. And this one is going to be difficult on a couple of different levels. First, this just isn't a comfortable or fun section to talk about because the content we're dealing with here is pretty sad, considering it is the destruction of an entire way of life that once existed on this planet, and it's just simply gone. Those days are erased. They're never likely to come back, and that's pretty tragic. But the second reason this section is going to be extremely difficult for me is because I am going to be I'm going to want to go off on all these little side tangents because there's so many little interesting side stories here. And each of these tribes that we're going to talk about was a very unique tribe with very, very fascinating cultures. But I'm just going to try to stick to what the end of instruction standards say you need to know. And in this first one, we're going to be looking at tribes of the plains and who they were and kind of just a general overview of how they lived. But I really think later I'm going to come back and do much more in-depth videos on many of these topics after I'm done with this series, of course, because they are very fascinating. But of course, as always, we need to start out with the objectives. This is point by point what the state says you need to know, and I would assume most states out there are probably pretty similar to this. So, examine the rationale behind federal policies toward Native American tribes, including the establishment of reservations. That's a pretty tragic story. The attempts to assimilate, I said not very comfortable at all, the stuff that particularly Native American children had to go through. The end of the Indian Wars at Wounded Knee. Of course, this is a series of conflicts that ends just in a catastrophe at Wounded Knee, one of the saddest moments in American history. The impact of the Dawes Act, that is, how is the government going to figure out a way to take away the last vestiges of tribal lands from the tribes. The impact that had on tribal sovereignty and land ownership. This is where they basically take the whole private, ownership of land concept and force it on the tribes. Compare the contrasting viewpoints of Native American leaders' resistance to the United States Indian policies. So there's going to be really 4 different speeches we're going to have to look at and examine, and you need to understand these different approaches that these tribal leaders had. That is Red Cloud with his Cooper Union speech, Seattle, Quanah Parker, the fierce Comanche leader, one of my favorite tribal leaders, simply because when I was in college at Southwestern Oklahoma State University, the alma mater, woo! I stayed in Quanah Parker Hall, and it was the oldest, most ragged, beat-up dorm on campus, but those of us who lived there without the air conditioning and enduring the suffering, we lived there, and it was a matter of pride. And there was a big portrait of Chief Parker there in the Commons area, and it was really awesome, and I wish I had that painting hanging on the wall behind me. I mean, Quanah Parker, awesome. And Chief Joseph, poor Chief Joseph, and poor the Nez Perce tribe and everything they had to go through. Of course, he expressed the sentiment of his people in his I will fight no more forever speech. So I'm seeing at least 3 videos here. Could do 4 depending on how carried away I get, but I have a tendency to get carried away, and I'm really going to try not to do that. So here we go. The clashes on the plains. Now, this clash of cultures is basically unavoidable. Why? Because the United States of America, white settlers are just streaming into this area where the Great Plains Indians lived. This constant flow of settlers is going to create friction, conflict. I mean, it's tribal lands, and people are moving on to it, so the tribes are going to try to defend it, they're going to try to protect it, they're going to do everything in their power to try and hold on to what is theirs, but it's a never-ending tide. And this never-ending tide is just going to keep coming on and on and on, and it's going to create all these hostilities and problems. And the end result, as I've already said, is an entire way of life, an entire culture that had progressed and gone on for 10,000 years or more, it's going to just vanish. It's going to eradicate the way these people lived. And it's very, very sad. Now, the tribes of the plains were very misunderstood for a variety of reasons. The people living in the east of the Mississippi River, just didn't know that much about them. And of course, they wanted their land. And one of the things you have to do if you want to, prepare yourself, that looks like I'm saying I'm crazy, psychologically, to go out there and basically take their land, you kind of have to justify it within your own mind. And you've got to say, so they were portrayed as just like these savages living out in mainly desert areas who were completely uncivilized. And if you can convince yourself of that, and yeah, they're not like us, so we're actually going after doing them a favor. We're doing a favor for the land, and we're going to civilize them and assimilate them and force them onto reservations. And that's kind of the mental gymnastics that they did. Now, this whole idea of the Plains savage Indian warrior was really not accurate. Each of these tribes was very distinct, and they were highly developed tribes. And the book throws in a token mention to the Osage and the Iowa. Now, I find this kind of interesting because I'm from Oklahoma. I've taught Oklahoma history for many, many years. And even in the Oklahoma history books, the Osage tribe really doesn't get a lot of mention. It just kind of says, oh, some of their land was taken away for the civilized tribes to settle on, and there was some conflict there. But in page 203 of the history book I'm using as my outline here, there's one mention of the Osage on one page, and there's one mention of the Iowa. So it's not really the tribes we're going to be looking at in this section, but they lived in the lower Missouri River region. And mainly these were farmers, and they lived in very small villages, and pretty peaceful for the most part. I mean, they're not going to be confused with like the Comanche and the Apache and tribes like that. And I also want to say this book, not one mention anywhere of Geronimo. Goethe does not get a mention, not one time. And this is a book that's supposed to fit the standards of Oklahoma history. And yeah, Oklahoma history, I mean, Geronimo, the legendary warrior, no mention. And it's kind of amazing. I mean, Geronimo is one of my favorite, war chiefs. And it's just, and actually calling him a chief's a bit of he was just a warrior. And no mention anywhere of him. So, I'm going to have to do a video on him as well. But, as I said, I don't want to get carried away here because they're not going to ask you about these tribes. So, we got to go on. It's the tribes further west. The nomadic tribes of the plains that you really need to be familiar with. Of course, the big one would be the Sioux, and followed closely by the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, really, they don't get much mentions either, but if you live in my state, you need to know who the Arapaho are for sure. So, it's mainly these three tribes, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. Now, they're going to show up time and time again throughout this section because they're the powerful tribes, the big tribes that basically the settlers are encroaching on their lands. And we're going to have a lot of conflict. And for the most part, they hunted buffalo. And this is a fascinating culture and lifestyle, very nomadic. When they get a hold of horses, as we'll mention here in a second, they're going to kind of abandon their farming ways. And they're going to become skilled warriors, skilled hunters. Like I said, a highly sophisticated culture and tribal structure within each of these. And these tribes, the Sioux and Cheyenne, closely related. And of course the Cheyenne and Arapaho kind of go together. So, Native American tribes, they had no formal government. They had no written constitution. They basically abided by what you would call tribal law. This would be stuff that developed over the millennia. The millennia. And these tribes, basically, they had chiefs, but there was no overseeing chief, as we'll get to later as well. These tribes were very known for their hunting skills, their skills as warriors and horsemen, and of course they produced some of the most beautifully crafted tools and clothing that you can find in artifacts and museums everywhere. I mean, you just look at the intricacies and the details and the stuff, each individual. It wasn't like they were mass producing shirts with the Nike swoosh and stuff on it that you look like just like every other person out there. This was very, very detailed A lot of time, effort, and energy and skill went into creating these artifacts. Now, life on the plains, as I said, 1598, near about that time, was when these tribes first got a hold of horses. Now, the horses were, of course, brought over by the Spanish conquistadors. This gave the conquistadors a huge advantage over the Native American tribes that they encountered and ultimately fought. And, of course, the Native tribes saw this, studied it, observed it, and some of these horses get left behind. And in the deserts of what is today Arizona and New Mexico, tribes there get a hold of these horses. It's going to give them a big advantage. And of course, other tribes are going to trade for them, steal them, do whatever. And once they master the art of really bareback horseback riding, it changes the way these tribes lived forever. Now they can travel further, they can hunt more efficiently than ever before. And once they got those, they're like, forget this farming stuff, we're going out there and we're following the buffalo, because this allowed them to chase and hunt the buffalo way more effectively than they did before. And the buffalo is the essential animal for their lifestyle, as we'll see in future videos. Now, they would have conflict with other tribes. I said they didn't really have a concept of private property, individual property, but they did have tribal lands. And not all tribal lands were created equally. So sometimes one tribe would encroach on another. That would lead to war parties and raiding parties and going and attacking and fighting other tribes, usually for the best hunting lands, because if you controlled that area, you wanted to keep the other tribes out. But raids and war parties. If you were a young Native American male, this was it. I mean, this was the epitome of your existence, was going out and doing this because you got to build prestige. I mean, you earned respect this way by going out and fighting as a warrior. Now, expert hunters were admired, but when it came time for war, you needed those warriors. And we still look at the word and hear the word warrior and we're like, yeah, that's awesome. I mean, these people were highly respected warriors. I mean, some of them are like legendary. I said I even slipped up earlier and said, Geronimo war chief. No, he was a warrior. Sitting Bull was the chief that everyone just loves talking about. No, it's Crazy Horse. He's the guy that leads the warriors out there. And if you're a young warrior, I mean, Crazy Horse, that's where it's at. So, how do they earn this respect? Well, killing enemies, that does happen, but they didn't really look at that and say, well, you were brave because you killed a bunch of enemies. You actually got respect and prestige through something called counting coup, which is pretty awesome when you think about it, because like if you're engaged in combat, they had these things called coup sticks. And if you rode up to an enemy or ran up to an enemy and touched them with this coup stick and then came out alive, unscathed to tell the story, like, that was awesome. I mean, that was how you earned respect and prestige. Now, as far as their family structures go, some of these tribes would be huge. I mean, by the time this whole thing plays out and you get to Little Bighorn, our 276 U.S. soldiers are facing thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. You're thinking these big tribes, but there were subgroups within them. Usually they would live with close family members and some extended family members, groups that could speak the same language. And you would be attached to these tribes, but it wasn't like they owned you or anything. It wasn't like you were a citizen of the government. They're going to watch your every move and make sure you pay all your taxes and all of this stuff. They actually had a lot of mobility. I mean, they could choose to come and go, follow different chiefs and clans and stuff like that. So generally they were really close to their extended family groups, and that was kind of where they felt comfortable. The men were, of course, going to be your hunters and your warriors. Women, they would prepare the meat. I mean, the men would go kill the buffalo, they'd bring it in, the women would skin it, the women would use it to make clothing, the teepees, the shoes, stuff like that. And I find it very interesting that if you were a woman in a lot of these tribes, you actually had a lot of freedom and authority over your own life. I mean, check this out. Many tribes actually allowed women to choose the husband they wanted. And that's kind of like what our society is today in Western civilization. You know, it's the man that'll ask for the date, and the women will say yes or no. It's the man that asks for her hand in marriage. She has the right to say yes or no. You know, he wants to get all lovey-dovey. She has the right to say no, so she does have that authority. Well, these tribes in this era was that way. And it's like a step up from like white American civilization at this time because, you know, when they have a wedding, the father gives the bride away to another man for a reason. You know, large numbers like this, it's the transfer of her to him. Now, we still do that ceremony and it's still beautiful, but it used to literally mean the father would give his daughter to another man. You know, and the father, if he didn't, you know, you even had to go up and ask like for permission to go on a date with her, you know, go courting and stuff. So this is kind of cool. I mean, the women had the right to say no, and they got to pick their husbands and stuff like that. So that's kind of awesome. You know, and a lot of tribes had like female leaders, you know, chiefs and stuff like that. Now, their religion, like I said, this was kind of one of the things that got them in conflict, or at least the conflict, this was used as an excuse, like, oh, they're not Christians, we need to go civilize them and send missionaries and all this stuff out there. The Native American tribes were very spiritual. And I use the word spiritual loosely because some people say, oh, I'm a spiritual person, but I'm not religious. That can mean all different kinds of things. They did believe that spirits or powerful beings, basically forces, I should say, controlled the weather and nature and, you know, your destiny. So the whole natural world was basically controlled by these spirits. So there was, you know, rain dances, there was sun dances and stuff like that. And there were members of the tribe who they thought were more in tune with these forces. So they had medicine men, and yes, they had medicine women. And here in this picture, I mean, this is a medicine woman. I like went out and intentionally said, I want to find a picture of a medicine woman. And there were some good ones. Yes, that is a woman. Yes, she looks very old and experienced and wise, somewhat intimidating. But these were the people that were respected. And they would go to them for advice and stuff like that because, you know, they had lived through life and they had the most life experience. And Native American tribes really respected their elders. That's one of the things I greatly admire about these cultures. I mean, they knew that the older people who lived through it all and had the most knowledge and wisdom and, you know, all their stories. They didn't have written language. All their stories and all their tales of morality and stuff were passed down orally. And these people were greatly admired. And I just love these pictures of these older Native Americans from this era. And it's sad to look at them because, you know, they got to live through the glory peak of, you know, their tribe, the heyday, but they also had to watch it all get shattered and destroyed right before them. And of course they died knowing that their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were not going to get to live the life and experience of the things that they did growing up. But these medicine men and medicine women and shamans were highly respected and revered. And as I said, all their morals, all their stories, their religion, their creation tales, everything was passed down through stories, myths, games, and good example. I mean, they knew the younger members of the tribe were looking up to them and were modeling them, and they tried to carry themselves accordingly. You know, virtually everyone in the tribe. So their lifestyle, it's nomadic. The teepees are going to be made out of the buffalo hides, and these things could be torn down and moved very quickly. And they just went up and down the plains for thousands of years following the buffalo. And they used every part of the animal. And this is another thing, I have to be really careful not to get on a tangent here, but I want to make a video sometime just talking about the extent of what they did with these animals. I mean, they wasted nothing. I mean, they took the horns and used those to make basically spoons and forks, and even the hooves of the animal, you know, they ground those down to make glue. This was so essential to their lifestyle, like everything hinged on the buffalo. And of course, at one time, you know, there were 65 million roaming up and down the plains. So there was a plethora of it. So that was the essential animal for their lifestyle. The last thing I'll say in this video is the tribal leaders, their chiefs. they basically ruled by council. I mean, you very rarely saw a tribe where there was like one big master chief. You know, you had chiefs who were kind of experts in different fields. And sometimes it was a group of people depending on the tribe. And they would rule by council, and these were the most respected people in the tribe. I mean, they were basically chosen by the tribe, and they were chosen because of respect. They weren't chosen because, oh, they had a lot of money, because obviously these tribes didn't have money, or they had a lot of clout, or political connections or something like the politicians of today, you know, most of them who are crooked crooks. These were respected and revered individuals. But you as a member of the tribe could basically choose, you know, if they factioned off and went in different areas, you could choose which ones to follow. So, you know, Sitting Bull will be chief of those who wish to roam free. So those who wanted to leave the reservation could follow him. You know, Crazy Horse, they would basically say, well, he's our war chief, and we're going to go fight for him, or you could go fight for another one. No one person was ever allowed to dominate the tribe. And that's kind of interesting because, you know, you can't really get a chief and compare him to like Hitler or something. So yeah, he's the dictator of everyone. Listen to him or die. That stuff just didn't happen. So no one person could dominate the tribe. And of course, they viewed the land as belonging to the tribe, not one individual person. So these cultures are very interesting because since they didn't have money and since you couldn't own the most land, you basically couldn't lord over people. I mean, that's literally going back to that old word like in Europe, you know, you were a lord and people lived on your land and you could basically like own them. That didn't happen here. So that's video number one, just a real quick run through of the tribes who actually lived in the plains that we're going to be dealing with in this section. The next one's going to be called Conflict on the Plains, and that was going to be about all the fighting and the strife. And of course we're going to get the Sand Creek Massacre, and I'll try to throw in the Ouachita Massacre just because, you know, this is for Oklahoma students primarily. And of course, the big one, the two big ones at the end. So look forward to that. And if you found this video useful, just please like, comment, subscribe, share, do all of that, and I'll be back with the next video, which is going to be called Conflict on the Plains, coming to you soon. Until then, I'm Robert with Reading Through History. We'll see you next time.